Good afternoon, everyone. It is officially afternoon for our Queensland participants. Thank you. Welcome and thanks for joining us to our lunchtime session on Fall Armyworm, preparing for the season. I'm Shakira Johnson, Farm Biosecurity Coordinator at AUSVEG. The aim for today is to share information about Fall Armyworm and to give you a platform to ask questions to a bunch of excellent experts we have from the Queensland Department of Ag and Fisheries, and we are looking to prepare ahead for the spring and summer growing season across the Goulburn Valley and New South Wales, down in that southern area. Before we get into that, we'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, wherever you're attending from. We pay respect to the elders past, present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And today we are broadcasting from Wurundjeri country. So a few housekeeping items before we get into it. We're recording today's session and we'll make that recording available on the AUSVEG YouTube channel, and we'll also send that recording out to all attendees today and people that weren't able to make it, and we'll push that out through a couple of different communications platforms as well. The session will go for about an hour with a couple of short presentations, and we're going to have a Q&A session with our panel of experts. And so we have a Q&A box down the bottom of your screen for attendees. So feel free to add your questions there. We also received questions during registration. So we've passed those on to our expert panel and they will be addressing those during the discussion. So we've got the team from the National Fall Armyworm Innovation System for the Australian Vegetable Industry, a project funded by industry levies through Hort Innovation. And we have Heidi Parks, who will share a brief overview of the project, followed by Melina Miles and John Stanley, who will discuss what to look for in susceptible crops and how fall armyworm moves between crops and regions. We're then going to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves and have a discussion around fall armyworm in the different crops and what opportunities there are to prepare and manage it for the coming season. So Heidi, I'll hand it over to you now. Heidi is a senior scientist at QDAF and is the project leader on the National Fall Armyworm Innovation System for Australian Vegetable Industry project. Thanks, Heidi.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Shakira, and a huge thanks to AUSVEG for organising and hosting this webinar. Okay, so hopefully you can see my screen there. The Fall Armyworm Extension Project kicked off in June this year. It's a 4-year project collaboration between the Department of Agriculture and Fisheries in Queensland and Agriculture Victoria. The project is funded by Hort Innovation's Vegetable Fund, and we'll soon have the grains and cotton industries on board to make it a truly collaborative project. So I think a real strength of the project is that it brings together a great diversity and depth of expertise in a cross-industry, multidisciplinary team. So we have entomologists and plant protectionists and extensionists. It's based across Queensland and in Victoria, with decades of experience in vegetable, grains and cotton industries. And you'll meet many of these team members today during the webinar. We also are really pleased to be working closely with our VegNet officers, Dave Shorten in Bowen, Darren Brown in the Lockyer Valley and Emily Scott in Gippsland, who are contributing really valuable on-ground knowledge and support for the project's extension activities. So the broad aim of the project is to accelerate the generation and use of knowledge and tools for the sustainable management of fall armyworm at an area-wide scale. And to do this, we're taking a different but certainly not a new approach to extension. So the approach is to establish and facilitate regionally based area-wide management learning groups, which are currently in the Bowen Burdekin, in the Lockyer Valley and in East Gippsland. In these learning groups, we're bringing the knowledge and experience of our growers and agronomists together with the latest fall armyworm research from across Australia and overseas, both public and private. And by doing this, we're working to identify the key tools, information and research needed for sustainable area-wide management of fall armyworm in these regions. And then addressing those key industry needs through activities like workshops, demonstrations, and field walks. And then the learnings that are generated through those groups will be extended to industry nationally through a range of channels. And that brings me to the second part of the project, which is to coordinate a national program of fall armyworm communication. And I'll talk a little bit more about how you can engage with that shortly. Skip back one more. So the third part of the project is to identify gaps in knowledge, skills, technology and practices, and to respond to those gaps as they emerge. So the regional area-wide management learning groups are a big part of this, but we're also identifying gaps through engaging with industry nationally in a series of workshops and through other activities like this webinar. And as well, we're also identifying R&D gaps through a national R&D symposium. So really at its core, the approach has been designed to be as responsive as possible to industry and research needs to accelerate the process of innovation and get the latest knowledge and tools into the hands of growers and agronomists as quickly as possible. So this is not the first time that Australian industries have looked to area-wide management of a pest, and we are drawing on the previous experience of industry with pests like Helicobacter and diamondback moth. We know that managing fall armyworm at a landscape scale will require cross-industry collaboration, which is why this project is working across horticulture, grains and other industries. We also know that building relationships that enable area-wide management of fall armyworm is as important as building the technical capacity and capability, which is why we are working and have established industry groups in a number of regions. So just finally, there are lots of ways that in the industry nationally can engage with us through this project to access the latest fall armyworm information, ask a question or provide input or feedback to the project. So the main channels are the Fall Armyworm Engagement Hub, which our Extension Officer, who is pictured here, Ramesh Puri, updates with project activities, research stories, links to resources and much more. And you can also use that Engagement Hub to connect with us and send through your comments or input. We also have a Fall Armyworm newsletter, which Ramesh prepares and sends out around 4 times each year. There's the Beat Sheet, which is a pest management website that's managed by our DAF Grains team, and it has some excellent fall armyworm resources and is also has many regular updates. We'll be running a number of national workshops on fall armyworm management over the next 4 years. So please keep an eye out for those. And we're also holding a national face-to-face R&D symposium in 2024, which will include a full-day showcase for industry on the latest research and innovation in fall armyworm management. So finally, please don't hesitate to contact Ramesh Puri or myself if you'd like any more information. Thanks, Shakira.
Thanks, Heidi. We'll save questions for the discussion after the presentation. So next up, I'd like to introduce Melina Miles. Melina is a principal entomologist with QDAF and has been working on helping growers to understand the economic thresholds of how and when to treat fall armyworm. Melina, can you share with us what you've been working on and what your research has found so far?
I certainly can. Thank you very much, Shakira. So as part of the entomology team with DAF, we were at the front line, I guess, when fall armyworm turned up in 2020. And so we now have going on 4 years experience with this pest, which in the scheme of things isn't very much when we think about what we know about Helicobacter management, for example, you know, something that we've worked on for, say, 40, 50 years. So I guess what I want to say that because a lot of the things that we say are based on our experience so far, and I guess we sort of reserve our our judgment on whether we've seen everything that fall armyworm will throw at us. So I guess my brief today has been to, give you a bit of an overview of what we think the key issues are, what the key experiences have been, and a bit of a heads up on some of the things that you need to be looking out for if you are in a situation where fall armyworm is likely to occur, or you think it might be likely to occur. So I'll get right into it. And these are some of the things that I think that you do need to know. They're around whether you are in an area where there is a risk of fall armyworm occurring in the crop and how big that risk is, how important monitoring is and how you go about it, and particularly how you identify fall armyworm and distinguish it from other caterpillars, which inevitably will be in the crop as well. And then those key management questions about whether you need to intervene, or whether there is enough biological control or abiotic factors playing a role that will prevent fall armyworm, despite being in your crop, from causing economic loss. And I guess what I wanted to share is, I guess for Victoria, we expect that the pressure and the risk that you will face is likely to be significantly lower than we see in, the really high risk areas in North Queensland and east and down the eastern seaboard into northern New South Wales. And just to give you a sense of what it was like in 2020, and I guess I want to say is that we don't have the same experiences now that we had in 2020 for the most part. The problem in 2020 was that many growers were ill-informed because we just simply didn't know. As a result, they got quite poor advice on what to do and what to use to manage fall armyworm infestations. We didn't know how quickly we had to move in those high risk situations. And for maize and sorghum growers and sweet corn growers, it was the first time in the history of growing those crops in Australia that we had a vegetative pest that was so devastating. So it really was just a sort of, compounding problem. And you can see there on the right-hand side a picture of a crop in North Queensland that was sprayed 3 times and still ended up like that and was subsequently ploughed out. And that created a real risk as far as fodder reliability in particular. For grain, it was an expensive impact, but for dairies and feedlots, that reliability of fodder. And I would have to say, of all the stories that I heard back in that sort of, that first year, the growers or the farmers, the farming sector that was most impacted were probably dairy farmers who grew their own fodder, found themselves in a position where they had neither the information they needed nor the equipment to manage those infestations. And so losses for dairy farmers were quite significant and very, very worrying. We've got Subra on the panel later, so if you have questions about sweet corn specifically, he's the person to ask. He's based in Bowen and works specifically on sweet corn. That industry was also extremely heavily impacted, and they continue to grow sweet corn in the same areas, but they are very reliant on insecticides and so have a very high risk potentially of resistance development. When it comes to what's impacted, fall armyworm arrived in Australia with a list of 350 hosts. You can see there on the left-hand side that in the red box that the number of hosts that really we have seen significant crop loss in is very limited. And beyond maize, sweet corn, sorghum, really, the list is quite short. And in all these cases, I would say now that we are able to manage them, manage fall armyworm quite effectively, even if it costs a lot of money to do so. So that's the challenge, I think, is really addressing how we make the management of fall armyworm an economic proposition for all those crops. Importantly, I think if you haven't had an experience with fall armyworm, I just wanted to sort of run quickly through a few slides just to give you a sense of what it is that it looks, how it looks in the field. Very inconveniently, fall armyworm females love to lay their eggs under the leaves and particularly low to the ground. So, if you're as old as me, bending over to check for them is a pain. But those larvae hatch from the eggs and very quickly disperse through the crop, hiding themselves away in little nooks and crannies. So probably, one of the first things that you might see is this sort of damage from those slightly larger larvae where you're getting the windowing. This is, the first expanded leaf out of the whorl. Or you might not see them at all if the density is low and they're hidden away in that whorl very quickly. Once you've got very big larvae, They come in all sorts of colours, a bit like Helicoverpa, and I put Helicoverpa here on the right-hand side because it's gone nowhere. It's still there. Often populations are mixed, fall armyworm and Helicoverpa. But this is when you will start to see quite significant damage to the crop. And this is the sort of thing that you see on a field level. So you'll see plants with a windowing. That windowing will persist as the crop grows. This sort of damage where you've got truncation, where they've eaten through the whorl. In this instance, these three images, in my opinion and our experience, would depict crops where if there was no more damage than that, that's not an economic loss proposition. A crop like this one on the bottom right definitely would incur significant economic loss just because of the level and the extent and the duration that defoliation has occurred. I just want to make a plug for destructive sampling. Often you'll have an infestation in a crop and you won't see damage if it's early, or you'll see damage but that infestation has already completed its development. So you cannot make sound decisions on whether you need to intervene or whether you're likely to incur loss unless you destructively sample. And that means opening up the whorl and counting the larvae. So I can see here that there are two very large larvae right in the middle of that whorl that I would not know were there if I hadn't torn that plant apart. How much risk are you at? Well, John will talk a little bit more about this in detail for Bowen, but what I just wanted to show you here is that there is a really strong gradient between the activity we see in North Queensland and the activity that we see as we come further south. So you can see in these tropical areas, the pressure is the moth catches in pheromone traps is very high. You can see the numbers here, sort of 90 to 600 per day. As we come further south and as we go into sort of major cropping areas in New South Wales, there's quite a discrete peak of activity, and we've seen that repeatedly over the last 3 years. I don't have data for Victoria, so I can't sort of show you that, but I suspect that it is more like what we see here, where there's a period of activity when the crops are in the ground. What this has allowed growers in the northern region to do is to shift their planting. So on the Darling Downs where I'm located, there will hardly be a maize crop grown post-December, because they know that if they have a crop in the ground from October to December, it's highly likely that they will see very light, if any, fall armyworm activity in that crop, and it will not require chemical control. If they plant it after December, they know that they need to be in the crop from emergence monitoring, and it's highly likely that they will need to intervene to prevent significant crop loss in that crop. So this understanding that comes from monitoring the activity in your local area is very important in deciding some of the agronomic factors that might limit the impact of fall armyworm. I put this up, I'm not going to read it all, but this is sort of the suite of things that industries told us that they needed or felt they needed in order to manage fall armyworm. And I think that from some of the questions that I've seen already put in with the registration sort of address those. But I guess what I would like to say about this is that all of these areas are addressed either by DAF or one of the universities or someone else who's working for industry to resolve these questions. Importantly, resistance to insecticides is something that people worry about all the time. Fall armyworm did indeed arrive in Australia with resistance already to synthetic pyrethroids and carbamates, and that was the reason that we saw so many crop failures in 2020, that they were the go-to products for many of the growers, and they simply do not work. Happily, the products that are, the products that we would recommend and that are under permit or registered for fall armyworm are all, there is no evidence of resistance in 2020-21. We've done that work again with Lisa Bird at New South Wales DPI, and in 2023, again, we saw no shift in susceptibility. So these are products that you can use with confidence in terms of insecticide resistance. Efficacy is a different question, and I'll deal with that in a tick. But one of the projects that I'm involved is understanding how much damage is too much damage. When does damage result in economic yield? Because you can have damage without economic yield, as I sort of described before. What the early indications of this work show is that it takes probably 2 to 3 weeks of severe infestation before you start to see either maize or sorghum start to lose yield potential. And that means that, you know, and I guess it applies to fodder. So when I talk about maize, I'm talking about both for grain and for fodder. So I guess I'm really pleased that this is the result, because it means that, you know, we are managing a population that's not always going to be damaging, or there's going to be a population that doesn't always require intervention. And it's a matter of everyone learning how to recognise that, that level. Just in terms of efficacy of these products, we've done a lot of, in DAF, we've done a lot of efficacy work. What I would say, and I've said it already, I guess, these products are not effective. Do not use synthetic pyrethroids or carbamates to try and control fall armyworm, because if they fail, you will get crop loss if the density is high enough. Chlorantraniliprole, Vandercore, Coragen, Spinedoram, Emamectin benzoate, very effective. Indoxacarb, moderately effective. The NPVs, we have not managed to get to work in broadacre situation where you're putting on one application. So it's not, at this point, these are not products that we recommend, but I think there's more work to be done. And certainly that may not be the sort of broad brush expectation of these products in sweet corn. There's a lot of NPV use, and so that requires a little bit more work. Ian Newton may be on the panel later. He's doing some work with a fungal infection that fall armyworm get, Metarhizium riley. Very encouraging for the Australian population that his early trial results are showing that compared with some of the other options that are available, it is very effective. So hopefully this will go through to commercial development, because we really do need some of these biological controls. And in terms of biological control, lots and lots of natural enemies attack fall armyworm, and both Suba and Praise are on the panel. They were involved in the parasitoid survey that was undertaken that revealed that there are over 20 endemic parasitoids attacking fall armyworm. So when I say, if you have a low density population, don't intervene with insecticides, because there are lots of things that happen in that crop if you don't disturb it. And that's what I mean, both between, you know, fungal pathogens, the wind, the rain, and these predators and parasitoids. There's a lot going on to help you out. So what is it? What's the management strategy look like? Well, I guess this is a best bet. Start watching your crop as soon as it's out of the ground. Many crops have been lost at that very early stage because people haven't realised just how quickly fall armyworm can eat and destroy seedlings. Then we have this period which we're addressing with the threshold trial, which says pretty much that, you know, there's a period here where you can sustain some damage, and then protecting the crop as you go into that reproductive stage. And I guess our experience has been that the attractiveness of the crop seems to decline. So there's still a little bit of a question about how you manage that end. But I can't stress enough how important this early monitoring is during emergence. And then in a nutshell, here are the little things that I've already covered, and I just wanted to reiterate. And I think that's a very rushed overview of fall armyworm in the north and how we manage it, and I think the lessons that other regions can take from that experience. Thank you, Shakira.
Thanks, Melina. Yes, there is so much going on in this space. So thanks for trying to summarize the highlights in 10 minutes. There's a few options for you to get extra information and follow up, and we'll give you some options at the end of this discussion. But in the meantime, I'd like to introduce John Stanley. John Stanley is an entomologist with QDAF, and John has been collecting data on the movement of fall armyworm in the Bowen region. So John, I'd like to invite you to share your slides.
Okay, thanks very much, Shakira.
Thanks, John.
I shall just get this happening. So can you see my slides? Okay, are those slides being shared now? Can you see them?
Not yet, John.
Not yet. Okay, I'll try that again.
Looking good, John.
Yep, I'm just opening up the... Right, okay.
Nice.
So, the Bowen experience and what it might mean to you down in the south. So, this section reports on work from the Queensland DAF team listed here. I won't go through it all, but many of them are on the panel here today, so I won't dwell. But I'll concentrate on the efforts to monitor fall armyworm in Bowen and down the eastern coast of Australia using pheromone traps, like the one here. So I'll quickly say this is a pheromone trap, often called a bucket trap or a funnel trap. And a pheromone lure is put in a little plastic cage at the top, and it catches the male moths, the fall armyworm male moths, and then kills them with a little insecticide block at the bottom there. So all this data you're going to see in the graphs that follow are from this sort of trapping. And this all started before I came up here, but I've been taken over that role at the moment. Right, so here's the first year at Bowen. So down the left there, we've got the fall armyworm trap catches per week, looking at about 8 to 10 traps. So when fall armyworm came into Australia in about February 2020 in far north Queensland, it then appeared in Bowen in the traps that Subra set up in March. And you can see those low populations in March through to April, but they very quickly became abundant populations on the sweet corn grown in the Bowen area. So that's quite a massive population that's grown in the local area, we think. And I will emphasize there, that's actually through the winter months. And as I show you later years, you'll see that that should be quite subdued by the winter months, but it obviously wasn't in that first year. So here's the next year. And so we've obviously got fall armyworm coming earlier, and then, but then peaking, I guess you'd say, in early July, but then dropping down and then coming back in about August, and then dropping out towards the end of the year. So we finish our sweet corn season in mid-November, and you can see how it drops down a bit there later on. Now that sort of pattern follows through the next year and even into the next year. So we're seeing that same sort of pattern. But I'll emphasize there that when we weren't aware of how to protect the crops from fall armyworm, massive populations were produced in that winter, even though that would be a more subdued time. So, so we now respond mainly with insecticides, and in that first year, as Melina was saying, we saw up to 80% losses of sweet corn production. Now we respond with the insecticides and typically achieve 80% success. Fall armyworm feeds in the tip, like Helicoverpa, which forces the cob out of the fresh loose market and into the pre-packed line of trimmed cobs. But fall armyworm also often feeds into the side of the cob, and that renders the cob unmarketable. So that's where the hit gets the sweet corn industry. So the upshot is that sweet corn production continues in Bowen, but occurs, it still incurs higher damage, and it's at a much higher cost than before fall armyworm was here. So in these subsequent years, you can see that the fall armyworm is coming earlier, and I'll just get onto these next slides. So this is a slide that Melina sent to me, you saw earlier, but that's basically showing that in these northern Queensland areas, we've got populations of fall armyworm pretty much throughout the year, very high counts on occasions and persistent populations. If we go into the next slide, you can see that as you move further down, so I've sort of labelled them clearly Queensland border, New South Wales border, and then northern New South Wales sort of Tamworth latitude. So you can see that you get just a sporadic population that then, as you move further and further south, you get the infestations later and shorter. And here's somewhere about the middle. This is around Dalby, so a place called Bowenville, and there's quite a prolonged population, so it either gets infested fairly early and has plenty of summer to have continued populations, but I guess it's about here that we'd be thinking perhaps that's where the transition is from permanent populations to the more migratory ones that are going to head on down south. Earlier this year, we went a bit crazy and checked some traps daily for a 4-month period at Bowen. this showed the populations were already present. So in that red square on the left, the populations were already present. As soon as we put sweet corn in the ground, eggs were appearing on seedling corn straight away. But what was interesting after that is that by going in daily, you could see the populations appearing, and they could be explained by the local temperatures. So we're not absolutely sure, but we think that those populations are acting more locally than you might think of a migratory insect. And then over on the right there in the cold chill of the blue square, that's a Bowen winter. And you can see how it really harms the population generation. So we don't get particularly strong winters. I think we got some nights there where they went down to about 5 degrees for a few hours. But this is emphasizing how poorly fall armyworm can overwinter. And I guess that would explain why we suggest that further south, it's going to struggle to get through the winters. Right, so I've got a couple of slides like Melina right at the end. There's a lot of words on them, but I'd like to quickly go through them for the take-home messages. This very first one is a bit of a combination of the experience in USA applied to the Australian situation, looking at how fall armyworm might migrate. So fall armyworm migrates in the spring and the summer. So even though it's called fall armyworm, think spring and summer is when it migrates. So that's the Australian October to January. So fall armyworm in cornfields in the US, they have their permanent populations in southern Texas and southern Florida. And then they move at least 2,000 k's northward, infesting corn crops all the way to Canada. And they've measured 400 kilometers per night is possible for this insect to move. So that gives a bit of the potential of what it can do. And we already know from that first year in 2020 that fall armyworm can migrate long distances southward in Australia. But we lack, and this is from that paper by Westerbrook, where they've looked at the type of weather systems that we have in Australia, and we lack the predictable prevailing winds. So migration timing will differ each year. It will not be very predictable. It depends on when we get suitable winds, and of course they have to be northerly winds, so blowing down towards the south, and they have to be warm enough, and they have to occur when fall armyworm populations are present and abundant for migration up here. So even though we can say fall armyworm is likely to migrate all the way down to southern New South Wales and possibly into Victoria, it's going to be quite difficult to predict that with any certainty, because it will depend on the weather patterns, which are not very predictable for that sort of migration. That's a different situation to the US, where they can predict things quite well. So even in that first year where we saw it move down south, even cyclone activity was implicated for that first 2020 dispersal. So fall armyworm, though, another important point is that fall armyworm does not overwinter in a dipause like Helicoverpa. So fall armyworm is unlikely to generate significant permanent populations in southern Australia. And what does this mean that you should do? So in my final slide, we've got the responses and opportunities that this sort of trapping and movement suggests. You need to monitor for the arrival of fall armyworm in your areas using pheromone traps. And I would suggest that you have several of them and place them near crops. That increases the likelihood of them showing you when they're there. Only 1 or 2 traps can easily miss an incoming population. Check the crops shortly after emergence. Fall armyworm will lay onto cotyledon stage maize and sweet corn and sorghum. So it's a very good idea to get out in that first few days of emergence to see whether you're seeing eggs on the crops straight away. And if they aren't controlled, those larvae can destroy seedlings. So for area-wide management in the future, we're thinking that some of this pheromone work, or pheromone trapping work, it might be possible to see when you could apply mating disruption or pupal destruction, or even attract and kill approaches. These solutions are not, ready and available yet, but it's possible through some of this automatic trapping, you might get that sort of daily trapping data that we were able to get earlier in the year. Right, so fall armyworm remains local for several generations, and that was shown by the trapping earlier this year, and that raises concerns for the development of insecticide resistance. very much like the Helicover paramidra that stays on farm and receives insecticides through several generations. So, and I think I'll leave that last point because Melina covered that quite well. And there's my example of what seedling corn can suffer if you just leave the eggs on it right from the start. So that had fall armyworm egg masses on it within 2 or 3 days of seedling emergence. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John. I'll invite the other panelists just to introduce themselves and sort of give a one-liner little elevator pitch on their role in the project. So we'll start with Ramesh, if you'd like to introduce yourself to the attendees.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm Ramesh Puri. I'm a lead extension officer for the National Fall Armyworm Innovation System for the Australian Vegetable Industry Project, based up in Bowen, North Queensland. I'm responsible for establishing and facilitating the Fall Armyworm area wide management group in the Bowen broadacre region. I'm also involved in developing and delivering the communication strategy, publications of newsletter, managing engagement hub, and providing support to other regional sites. Thank you.
Thanks, Ramesh. We'll move on to Subra. If you can just introduce yourself, Subra.
Yep. Yep. I'm Siva Subramaniam. My full name is I'm an entomologist based in Bowen for the last 24 years. Currently, in the last 4 years, I'm working mainly on fall armyworm research aspect, looking at some management options for fall armyworm.
Wonderful. Thanks, Subra. And we have Ian Newton, who has dialed in. Ian, if you can just introduce yourself.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Oh, great. Yeah, so I'm Ian Newton. I'm an entomologist in far north Queensland, based in Mareeba. I guess I have been involved in fall armyworm since the beginning of the incursion. And my area of work is really in the biopesticides, and in particular, I'm looking at developing a fungal-based biopesticide for fall armyworm. That's Metarhizium riley, which Melina placed the slide up earlier, I believe. Thanks.
Thanks, Ian. And last but not least, Praise.
Hello, can you hear me now?
We can. Thanks, Praise.
Yeah, so my name is Frezzel Tadle, and I am a senior plant protectionist based in Gatton. So my involvement with the project is I'm the one in charge for establishing learning groups here in Lockyer Valley region. And I am also involved in doing research for parasitoids of fall armyworm.
Beautiful. Thanks, Praise. So we would just like to remind attendees that you can submit questions down in the Q&A box down in the bottom of your screen. We will start addressing those, but before we get into your Q&A session, we'd like to ask you some questions. So I'm just going to launch a poll. We're asking, have you seen fall armyworm in your region over the last few years? And if you have, what crops have you seen the most fall armyworm related damage in? And I've given you a few options there. While those results are coming in, I'd like to invite our panelists to start addressing some of our questions. So we've heard from Melina and John today about where fall armyworm comes from and what are the migratory patterns, but perhaps the panel would like to speak a little more to that. So where do they think they're coming in from, and what are the patterns that you're seeing across Australia? Melina, John, Super.
Well, I guess the only thing that I would add is that, I didn't want to leave the impression that fall armyworm isn't occurring further south. I guess we know that some of the sort of high fodder production areas in coastal New South Wales get quite high fall armyworm pressure, and there's quite a little bit of chemical control used there to prevent losses. We also, I guess, are under the impression that there's probably quite a lot of fall armyworm movement that never results in infestation simply because there aren't available hosts. And one of the little bits of evidence that we have of that is when we were trying to get an idea of how far fall armyworm was going when it first arrived, and we thought, oh, well, let's see if there's any anywhere to put a trap out at Longreach, for example, in far western Queensland. And there was I think at the research station there was a crop of forage sorghum grown. A trap went up near it, and almost immediately fall armyworm moths were caught in that trap. So, you know, that was quite a surprise and a bit of an eye-opener, and, you know, does sort of indicate that there is movement. And there are plenty of agronomists all over the place in Queensland who, you know, think that they've hidden their crop of forage sorghum or their maize away in a little sort of, you know, secluded valley that inevitably get fall armyworm infestation. So I think that there's probably a lot of maybe even continental movement of fall armyworm, and we only see them when they arrive in susceptible crops and we see damage.
Thanks, Melina. Any other comments from any of the other panelists?
Yeah, I'd just like to add the comment that that is the sort of thing they see in the US as well, that the insect can move quite broadly, and but it will bring, you know, very low numbers of moths can lead to very high populations very quickly. So some of the papers are using population increases of 30-fold in a month or 300-fold in a month as an increase, an intrinsic rate. So that's the absolute maximum, but that's how quickly it can get out of hand.
We've had some questions come in. This is a good one. Is there any likelihood that fall armyworm could adapt to colder weather like Q-fly has and become a greater problem in Victoria? Any ideas from our panelists?
Well, I guess we can only learn from the overseas experience where, you know, fall armyworm has been, its native range is sort of South America and North America as a migrant. And we know that as it moves northwards, those populations die out, and it's probably been doing that for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years. And, you know, that pattern hasn't changed over time. As a result of adaptation to those colder conditions. I think that if we were to see a change in that, it would probably be as a function of increasing temperatures in those northern regions as opposed to the fall armyworm adapting. So maybe, you know, if we have a similar sort of, you know, warmer environment in Victoria or a longer summer, we might start to see more fall armyworm. But I think it would be more a function of, you know, a change in the climate as opposed to a change in the fall armyworm itself.
Thanks, Melina.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think, you know, the insect adapting to the cold would take a lot longer than the rate of change of that the climate's changing.
Ian, while we've got you, there's a great question that's come through related to your work. What is a likely time frame for the biopesticide that Ian is working on to be commercially available, if all goes according to plan from here?
Yeah, that's a really hard answer. I guess it's an absolute sort of nightmare to sort of go through the whole, I guess, commercialisation and particularly the registration process. And that's the real unknown. I guess I'm sort of working on this very much as a sort of part-time sort of project amongst a whole bunch of other projects. So I'm doing a little bit of work on it, but it is showing a lot of promise. I guess what I'm hoping to do is produce enough data to sort of show that it has, I guess, commercial viability, and then might be sort of eventually sort of taken up by, I guess, commercial interests who would be sort of wanting to, I guess, go through that the final development and registration process. But I just can't see it sort of happening in a hurry. So even if I had, you know, millions of dollars and lots of resources, it would still take a few years.
Yeah, right. Thanks. Are there any other comments? Subra, you've been doing a bit of work on some of the parasitoids and a few of the others. Any ideas on potential for commercialization there, like the different companies that rear beneficials? Is there some interest in commercially rearing those?
Yes, there are some native or endemic parasitoid we found. They're mainly attacking the fall armyworm larval stages. So quite a few there. Most of them are naturally they are in lower numbers, but to breed them in commercial scale or anything take a bit of time. Actually, some of them we have put some attempt to breed a couple of key species. To next one, there are some difficulties to breed them in an artificial condition. So it might be currently there's none. But what we found endemically available is currently none available to use as a very efficient parasitoid yet. But except the Trichogramma proteosome is egg parasitoids used for Helicoverpa. There's a small, here and there we found some evidence they attack fall armyworm eggs also, but not in a greater numbers yet. So there's a couple of predators have a bit of potential. That's what we're working on now. There's some predatory beetles and some predatory bugs have showing some great potential to control fall armyworm. So there's a bit of opportunity on the predators are a bit more easier to breed than the parasitoids, the current situation. So they may be in some time. So there's opportunity to use the predators until the parasitoids get into the commercial scale.
Great, thank you. We've had a couple more questions coming in. Richard Smith has asked, are there any findings on the timing of sprays for maize silage? Melina.
Yep, I can answer that. So essentially, maize for silage can be managed exactly the same way as maize for grain. So I guess because this is a defoliating pest in the vegetative stage primarily, that the goal of both maize for silage and maize for grain is to get it to the reproductive stage with the biggest canopy possible. So to that point, you know, sort of to tassel, the management is exactly the same. And I guess I described it very briefly that you want to make sure the crop establishes. If you're growing in an area where you're likely to get fall armyworm infestation from the time it's out of the ground or in those early sort of earlier than V4, it needs to be controlled because you will lose seedlings. But from that sort of V6 through to V12, 14 tassel and so on, you know, you can probably incur quite a lot of visual damage without impacting on yield. So, you know, I think, I guess the question sort of invites me to say, you know, you would spray it at this time or that time, but I guess what I would really encourage is monitoring that says, you know, what density of fall armyworm and how big are they? And not just based on one check, but maybe on, you know, regular checking at least weekly if you're in a reasonably moderate to high pressure region, and making your decisions from there. And I guess what we've learned in crops that are sort of, you know, V8 or younger is that, you know, 2 larvae per plant that are there persistently, large larvae doing damage, it sort of gets you on that cusp of potentially reducing the canopy enough to impact on yield. I'm more than happy to sort of, you know, follow up with a bit more conversation because there are a few sort of nuances about, you know, the pattern of infestation and shading and things like that. But I'd be really encouraging of, you know, basing it on what you see in the crop in terms of larval infestations, not damage and not a scheduled spray.
Related to that, Nick has asked how much does chemical control add to costs, and how late in crop development is chemical control possible or effective?
So I guess
in relation to maize specifically, sorry.
Yeah, so I guess, you know, if we rule out the ineffective products which are relatively cheap and we're focused on the effective chemistry, you know, you probably can't spray fall armyworm for less than, say, $60 a hectare. So that's sort of where, and the price can go up significantly higher. There is there's been quite a bit of work on banding, particularly for earlier stage crops, which gives you quite a significant cost saving if you're able to do that. But I think maybe the question about how late can you control it is around, you know, will chemicals work on a big plant? Well, I think the answer to that is yes. And, you know, sweet corn has been very effective in spraying and controlling fall armyworm right through until, you know, sort of late reproductive stage, or when they harvest, up until they harvest. So, you know, a combination of good application, the right water volume and so on, will result, and effective insecticides, it seems that fall armyworm is entirely manageable.
Nice, thanks, Melina. I'll just share the results from our poll. So we've got here, have you seen fall armyworm in your region? Out of 9 respondents, we've got 2 for yes, 2 for no, 5 for not sure. Fair enough. It couldn't look like a bunch of other things, as Melina briefly touched on in her presentation. And what crops have you seen the most fall armyworm related damage in? And maize is standing out on top with 7 out of 9 responses, and then 2 out of 9 for corn and 1 out of 9 for sorghum. We will share these results after this webinar when we distribute some information and communication. So we'll endeavour to answer some additional questions that we weren't able to address today. And I'd just like to share my screen just for some, you can scan these barcodes to, these QR codes, sorry, to either subscribe to the AUSVEG Biosecurity Frontline newsletter, where we will distribute communications relating to fall armyworm, but also you can contact Rose or myself for any vegetable, potato, biosecurity related questions you may have. But you can also head to the Fall Armyworm Research Development and Extension for Horticulture Engagement Hub run by QDAF by scanning that code there, or you can grab Ramesh's email address and email him, and he can direct you to any of these experts that were present on the panel today. So I'd just like to finish by asking our panelists what their take-home, I think we've had a few take-home messages, especially from Melina on monitoring in those early stages. But if I could just invite the panelists to deliver a take-home message for our attendees today. Ramesh.
Yeah, if it is fine, yeah, I want to go ahead with some of the take-home message for myself and maybe for the growers and industry attendees over here. Maybe as the presentation and the discussion went through, maybe the monitoring part of the crop in the very early stage, focusing on under the leaves. But sometimes the fall armyworm might lay eggs on the upper surface of the leaves. So monitoring is very important from the early stage of emergence. And about the symptoms of damage, that is like a windowing damage by fall armyworm. And the destructive sampling, which is very important, that when we just see the crop, we don't see any larvae or any pest, mainly the fall armyworm, but they are hidden inside the wall or inside the stem skins. So destructive sampling looks very much effective to have that observation of infestation levels in crops. And the resistance insecticide, like the synthetic pyrethroids and carbamates, and using the susceptible identified insecticide towards fall armyworm. So need to consider about those synthetic pyrethroids and caramides, not using it. But the more information we can find it in the APBMA website or in BeatSeed and in Fall Armyworm Engagement Hub.
Great, thanks, Ramesh. Anyone else?
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I'd like to put 2 bobs worth in. I'm looking forward to these automated traps for what they might tell us about how well this insect moves. So when we get pheromone traps that are checked far more regularly, and this can all be done back to an app on the phone, with automated traps, they're not here yet, but I'm looking forward to those perhaps telling us some of these questions about, or answering some of these questions about where Fall Armyworm is coming from and how it's moving.
Thanks, John. Anyone else before we wrap up? Okay, great. All right, well, that's all we've got time for today. We will, a week from now, email around a link to the recording and some answers to some of the questions from today and some additional questions that we weren't able to get to. And if you have any further questions, please feel free to email us. Thank you very much to the QDAF team for taking time to share their knowledge and expertise with us today. And for those of you online, I hope you've found the information we've presented useful. And if you have any further questions, like I said, please feel free to send them through. And in the meantime, take care and we'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone.